What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to All Sports Talk with Peter Burtnett. Quick note on that. I'm thinking about kind of rebranding, settling on a specific niche, and maybe renaming the channel College Football Talk. There isn't really a channel out there. Obviously, it's kind of just a general phrase when you talk college football talk, but there isn't really a channel that's called that. So let me know your thoughts in the comments below if maybe I should make that change. But you've seen in the title, this video we're going to be going over two more contenders that I am really high on. This video kind of came about, again, kind of like the last video, because of a comment that I saw saying that I was sleeping on Florida State and USC. But believe me, I am anything but sleeping on both of those two teams. I think they are probably along with Alabama in those four contender spots for being the favorites to potentially unseat Georgia, and I'd say along with Ohio State as well. I think Michigan is the best suited to compete with Georgia. But again, look at my last video to hear those points. In this video, I'm going to be focusing on the Seminoles and the Trojans because I think both of those teams are very high powered. They've got a lot of returning production. They've made some probably smart transfers. You never know until you see them out on the field, but both teams have a really good shot to make some noise. I would say they're the favorites in both of their conference, and both have high expectations. So without further ado, let's dive into it. We're going to start out with Florida State, and like how we're going to start with USC later in the video, where else can you start but the quarterback? You've got Jordan Travis, who leads a unit that ranked 16th nationally in scoring and 10th in total offense. And Travis himself had 3,200 passing yards, 24 touchdowns, and just 5 interceptions. So he's a very efficient quarterback. He's smart at making his reads. He's able to fit passes in to tight spaces. And he has some good wide receivers to throw to as well, led by Johnny Wilson, who was just shy of 900 receiving yards last year. Another target, Mycah Pittman, his brother, obviously, Michael Pittman Jr., playing for the Indianapolis Colts in the NFL, and interestingly enough, played for USC. So this video, there's a lot of connections going on, but there's another good addition is Trey Benson out of the backfield. He ran for 990 yards, 6.4 per carry with 9 touchdowns. And on the offensive line, they return three starters at different positions, and they have a fourth starter. I'm looking at the depth chart right now. You've got Maurice Smith starting at center, and Darius Washington also in bold. I'm looking at Athlon Sports. They have a really good college football preview every year that I really dive into. So they have four guys on the line that are returning starters, and then they dipped into the transfer portal here on the line. And I'll touch more on this point when I talk about USC, because I think Florida State's a little bit more cemented. But a guy like a Casey Roddick coming in from Colorado is projected to start at left guard. And then they've also got a couple other guys, Jeremiah Byers from UTEP and Keandre Jones from Auburn, who are there more likely for depth. It's possible they start. Byers is a right tackle and Jones is a right guard. So certainly bolstering their offensive unit. And then at tight end, they've got Marqueston Douglas and Jaheim Bell. So a couple of other targets for Jordan Travis and a couple of guys that can help with the run game as well. And again, very high-powered offense, and they return 8 starters from that unit. Florida State is going to be one of the tougher teams to stop, definitely in the ACC and potentially in college football, again, already having ranked in the top 10 in total offense. So now, shifting gears over to the defense. Similarly, actually exactly the same, 8 starters returned. So they get the bulk of their defense back, and it's really led up front by an all-ACC defensive end first-teamer Jared Verse and starting defensive tackle Fabian Lovett Sr. And they're joined also. They're really bolstering the line, which I think is important because at the line of scrimmage is probably where you take the most bumps in a game and where you really need your depth to step to the front. And so they're bolstering their depth here as well with some defensive tackle transfers in Braden Fisk from Western Michigan and Daryl Jackson Jr. from Miami, and then a defensive end transfer, Gilbert Edmond from South Carolina. So guys who have some experience, a couple of guys who have played at the Power 5 level, and again, kind of getting that depth on Florida State's defensive line. And then they also return ACC Defensive Rookie of the Year Patrick Payton on the other end. He'll likely pair with Byron Turner on the other side of the line of Jared Verse and Edmond, who will likely be on one side of the defensive line. Verse had 9 sacks and Payton had 5 sacks, so they both are able to get to the quarterback. They're both able to provide pressure, and they both will lead a very strong defensive line. The big loss for the Seminoles is all-ACC safety Jamie Robinson, but FSU returns 4 other starters in the secondary, which is made up of 5 players, and both starting linebackers, Kalen DeLoach and Tatum Bethune. And those guys in the secondary are Renardo Green, Jerian Jones, Kevin Knowles II at nickelback, and Akeem Dent at strong safety. So again, it's easy. I said this in the last video. Sometimes it just sounds like names, but it shows that there's guys with experience. They're guys who have received some postseason honors and who have proven themselves to be really good defenders in leading Florida State to an 11-2 record and a close 6-point loss at home to Clemson. So that'll be tough. They do go into Death Valley to play the Tigers this year. It is early. It's actually, I mean, it's week 4. So they open with a tough game against LSU, then they're home against Southern Miss and at Boston College, and then at Clemson. And after that, they have a couple of tough tests that could be slip-ups at Wake Forest and at Pittsburgh, and then 2 of the last 3 games are home against Miami and at Florida. So you got those Sunshine State games, which, always at least bring a competitive edge. They're definitely not always close. But I think Florida State legitimately has a shot to finish with 1 losses or even finish undefeated. If they can get by LSU and then, if they do lose to Clemson, win out the rest of the way and then maybe beat Clemson in an ACC championship game because there's no divisions this year, then Florida State is probably in the college football playoff as long as they don't slip up a second time like they did last year. And that was a loss to Wake Forest, to losing Sam Hartman to Notre Dame probably won't be quite as tough. So that's the Seminoles. Again, right now, if I had to put a record on them, I'd say they probably lose either Clemson or one of those other road games I mentioned, Wake Forest and Pittsburgh, but I think they win out the rest of the way. I think whether they lose to Clemson or win the first game, they beat them either again or for the first time in Charlotte in the ACC championship game and lock up a college football playoff spot. And I think they definitely could compete with Georgia. I don't see them matching up quite as well with the Bulldogs as Michigan. Probably would have a better shot than Washington. Again, remember the Huskies are my dark horse team. But Florida State's definitely in a prime position. And believe me, the guy who commented that, I'm not sleeping on the Seminoles at all. So now, shifting gears over to those Trojans going across the country to Southern California. And again, like I said earlier, it all starts with the quarterback. And here, legitimately the best quarterback in the country, the reigning Heisman Trophy winner, with a couple guys like Bryce Young and CJ Stroud going to the NFL, he will lead the way for the quarterback position really at the college level, I think, this year. And that brings a lot of expectations for Caleb Williams. He threw 42 passing touchdowns to lead the country and won USC's 8th Heisman Trophy, which is impressive in and of itself. And he's got plenty of weapons coming back. He's got three starting wide receivers: Mario Williams, Brendan Rice, and Taj Washington, all coming back. They were all starters last year, and they're also adding a Pac-12 all Pac-12 first teamer, Dorian Singer from Arizona. So the offensive weapons at Caleb Williams' disposal are the same and even one better. And I also think coming out of the backfield, they're maybe even a little bit underrated because they have Marshawn Lloyd transferring in from South Carolina. He, again, has that Power 5 experience. He put up some good numbers, I think, for the Gamecocks. And they also have Austin Jones, Zachariah Branch, and Raleek Brown are some of what the magazine again calls some of the most dangerous weapons on the West Coast out of the backfield or in the slot. And not only that, they had 5-star tight end Deuce Robinson, who's 6'6" and adds another dimension to the offense. You know, the type of thing where you're in the goal line situations and you just kind of toss it up there, throw a fade back there. I know fades statistically don't work as well as their run, as often as their run, but having a weapon like that certainly provides some again, depth to the offense. And on the line, I said I was going to talk about this a little bit more in depth. They've got 2 returning starters, and they're bringing in some transfers as well. They're bringing in three starters potentially from the transfer portal. And what I think about that, they're not quite as established as Florida State, because again, Florida State I think had three positions that they're bringing back stars, and then they had a 4th guy who started pretty often as well. Kind of in like in a backup spot on the depth chart. So there's 2 ways that I think this can go. One is the guys who they have coming in. They'll either, drawing from the previous experience they have, they'll be able to plug in, they have the experience, they know what to do, or they just, for whatever reason, transfers don't always work. We've seen individual transfers or teams that bring in a lot of guys in the portal and they just don't fit for whatever reason. I feel like offensive line is probably a better chance because you look at some of the skill positions, especially quarterback or wide receiver, running back. Those guys often have a little bit more, inflated egos. And so if they're not directly, making the impact that they wanted to, sometimes trouble can happen. But again, that's not as big of an issue I wouldn't expect on the offensive line, but it's certainly a possibility. So I think it's one of 2 ways if they're able to mesh, and they're familiarity with the quarterback as well with Caleb Williams is, I would say, even more important, because if they, just have that connection that a quarterback needs to have with his offensive line to be able to anticipate when, there's somebody coming off around his blind side and there's just this kind of like knowledge between the quarterback and his line when that's happening. If that is built in, the upcoming days, we're coming up here on the beginning of really a fall camp's not too far away because games are less than a couple months away. So this time is probably most important for that, in developing that bond. And if they can, this USC offense, long-winded, but this USC offense, it will be extraordinarily dangerous. And I don't see any defense aside from maybe that Georgia defense being able to stop this high-powered offense. And then looking at the Trojans defense, they were plus 22 in turnover margin last year, forcing 29 turnovers. So that sort of success, you see like a big turnover margin one year, and then it's expected for it to drop off a little bit this year. But a big part of helping it maybe to not drop off as much is they're returning 8 starters on the defensive end. So a lot of guys who had that production of forcing the turnovers last year are coming back, led by Kalen Bullock, the strong safety who had 5 interceptions, and a couple of other starting DBs, Max Williams, Jalen Smith, Sierra Wright. And so all of those guys have the experience as well. And Eric Gentry at the linebacker position is what again this magazine calls a unicorn of a linebacker, who is able to find where the ball is at, which is what obviously you want from every linebacker, because they're not only quarterbacking the defense, but in doing so they're looking for where the ball is at every moment and just going on a beeline to get to that ball. And on the defensive line, they've got a couple of returning starters, but they've also got a highly regarded Georgia transfer, Bear Alexander, coming in. He's only a sophomore, but again, a lot of hype around Bear Alexander, and he joins some other sturdy building blocks for the Trojans, and they should have a solid pass rush overall. And they did have some weaknesses last year. They were 8th worst in the FBS in yards allowed per play. So consistently, a lot of yards on every play, which is kind of typical in the Pac-12, although some teams are able to play better defense than others. So you're going to have some high-scoring games, you're going to have some lower-scoring games. It's just part of it. But they were also 94th in scoring defense, so kind of being able to stop drives and either force a field goal or just stop the offense from scoring entirely was something that USC struggled with a bit. and a team like Georgia was obviously pretty lethal at, aside from a few games. But I think USC, they've got a honestly real easy start to the schedule. They've got San Jose State, Nevada, and Stanford at home. Then they're at Arizona State, at Colorado, home against Arizona. So honestly, Colorado's going to have some hype, so that might be interesting, and maybe Arizona State can start to turn some things around a little bit. But I would expect them to be 6-0 heading to their game on October 14th at Notre Dame. And really, from there, it is a tough back half of the season for the Trojans. They've got at Notre Dame, then home against Utah, who's been their Achilles heel the last couple years, especially, and definitely last year, beating the Trojans twice. The Utes beat them 43-42 midway through the season, and then 47-24 in the Pac-12 championship game. So it is at home, though. That I'm sure will help. At California, home against Washington, at Oregon. That 2-game stretch will probably define their season. Because I guess there's kind of it's a 4 out of 5 game stretch that will define their season. At Notre Dame, home against Utah, home against Washington, and at Oregon with a game against the Golden Bears in Berkeley in between. I think I would expect them to be able to handle Notre Dame, although with Sam Hartman coming in at quarterback and a lot of the Fighting Irish team returning, it'll certainly be a tough test in South Bend. But I know from experience actually going to the Cincinnati Notre Dame game a couple of years ago that opposing fans can certainly take over Notre Dame Stadium, and it's not, and from seeing Georgia do it a few years ago as well, and it's not as imposing as maybe it once was. And I'm not saying that can't come back. I don't want to piss off any Fighting Irish fans, but it definitely isn't. It isn't as much of a fortress as maybe it used to be. So I think that's a winnable game. I think you never want to undersell the Utes because they've proven it back to Pac-12 champions. I think the fact that game's at home though is big for the Trojans. I think they're able to get it done then. And then I think those 2 games against Washington and Oregon, just because going undefeated is so hard, if they don't slip up before, I think they drop either one of those games. But again, like Florida State, I would expect the Trojans to have one loss heading into the Pac-12 championship, and then they'd have to beat Washington or Oregon again, is what I would predict. And I think the second time around, they would beat one of those teams. And obviously, if they did lose to one of those teams in the regular season, they'd face off in the Pac-12 championship game. So, really, I think the Pac-12 championship game this year, especially if you've got just 2 teams, Washington and USC, or Washington and Oregon, or USC and Oregon, if you've got any combination of 2 of those teams that end up with 1 or fewer losses, it virtually will be a college football playoff play-in game, assuming that, same sort of situation with Ohio State and Michigan doesn't happen this year, which is a high possibility, or same thing can happen with the SEC with Georgia and Alabama, or maybe even Tennessee. I'd expect the Volunteers to take a slight step back this year. But that's my breakdown of Florida State and USC. It went a little bit longer, about the same as the last video, really. Just makes it a little tougher for me in editing. But if you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, comment your thoughts below on maybe what you think the Seminoles final record will be, where they'll finish, either in the playoff or win a New Year's Six Bowl, and same for your thoughts on what the Trojans will be able to do this year. But again, if you've watched the end of this video, thank you so much for supporting the channel. It means a lot to me, and I will see you guys next time. This is Peter Burnett, All Sports Talk, signing out. Peace.